The number was 847, 847 miles. I stared at the logbook for a long time, the worn brown leather one I kept in the kitchen drawer beside the takeout menus and the spare keys and all the other small, unremarkable things that make up a life. I had been keeping that logbook for 4 years, insurance habit. My father drilled it into me as a teenager: record your mileage, document your journeys, build your evidence before you need it. I never thought I would need it the way I needed it on that particular Thursday morning in November, standing barefoot on the kitchen tiles while my wife slept upstairs. Diane's mother, Patricia, lived 6.1 miles from our front door. I had driven the route myself 40 or 50 times in 7 years of marriage, through Pendleton Road, left at the lights by the dry cleaner, past the little park where the dog walkers gathered on Sunday mornings. 6.1 miles one way, 12.2 miles round trip. In 11 Fridays, that was 134 miles. Give or take the occasional detour, the supermarket stop, the petrol station, call it 150. The logbook said Diane's car had covered 847 miles on those 11 Fridays. 697 miles that had no explanation. And my wife was asleep upstairs, not knowing I was standing in the kitchen holding the quiet, patient proof that something in our marriage had been a lie. Here is what I want you to understand before I tell you what happened next. I am an architect. I have spent 20 years training myself to see the thing beneath the surface, the structure underneath the finish, the load-bearing wall behind the plasterwork, the foundation that determines whether everything above it will stand or fall. By the time I stood in that kitchen with the logbook in my hand, I already knew, not suspected. Knew. The way you know when a crack in a wall is cosmetic, and the way you know when a crack means something beneath it has shifted irrevocably. Something beneath my marriage had shifted. What I did not know, what nobody in that house knew, what nobody in Diane's family knew, what almost no one in this story knew until the night I chose to tell them, was that while my wife had been spending her Fridays somewhere that was not her mother's house, I had been quietly building something that would change the entire landscape of every single life I am about to describe to you. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started. Before we go any further into Marcus's story, we'd love to know where you're watching from. It's always extraordinary to see how far these stories travel, from living rooms to late-night commutes, from one side of the world to the other. Let us know your city or country in the comments below. Your support genuinely means the world to us. And if this story moves you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories just like this one. Now let's go back to Marcus Webb and the Thursday morning that changed everything. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 38 years old. I am a partner at Webb & Vance Architectural, a firm I built with my closest friend Samuel Vance over 11 years, from a shared office above a dry cleaning shop on Creston Street to a practice with 14 staff and a reputation, in certain circles, for doing work that was quietly exceptional. I met Diane Hartwell at a charity auction in the spring of 8 years ago. She was 30 then, wearing a green dress and arguing cheerfully with the auctioneer about the provenance of a mid-century lamp she had no intention of bidding on. She had a laugh that filled a room without trying to. I was immediately, helplessly interested. We dated for 14 months before I proposed. I proposed in the kitchen of my flat on a Tuesday evening because we had been talking for 3 hours about nothing consequential: a restaurant she wanted to try, a podcast I had been listening to, the specific way the autumn light came through the window over the sink, and I looked at her and understood, with the clarity of a structural calculation that simply resolves, that I wanted to be in that kitchen having that conversation for the rest of my life. I did not have a ring, I had a question. She said yes before I had finished asking it, and then cried briefly and then laughed at herself for crying. We married in the spring of the following year. 43 people, a converted barn in the county, a long afternoon. Gerald paid for most of it, which I had mixed feelings about and which Diane said not to overthink. I did not overthink it. I thanked him formally and genuinely, and we shook hands in the way of two men who respect each other's terms without fully agreeing on them. The first 4 years were good. I want to say that clearly because it matters. They were genuinely good. I do not look back on them with the retrospective distortion of a man rewriting history to suit his grievance. Diane was warm and curious and often surprising. She had a sharper mind than her family gave her credit for, and she knew it, which made her slightly impatient with being underestimated. We cooked on Sunday mornings. We argued about films. She came to site visits and asked good questions. She read my project proposals and told me honestly when something wasn't working, not technically but narratively. Buildings tell stories, she said once, and she was right. What I did not fully appreciate on that first evening, though the evidence was there for an architect to read, if he had been looking with professional eyes instead of the soft, undiscriminating eyes of a man falling in love, was the world she came from. Gerald Hartwell, Diane's father, was a man whose name appeared in the financial press roughly once a quarter. He had built a commercial property empire across 3 decades, shopping centers, office parks, mixed-use developments, and he wore his wealth the way some men wear cologne. Applied heavily, impossible to ignore, intended to precede him into every room. He had grown up with nothing, which he reminded people of constantly, and which he used as justification for his conviction that money was the only honest measure of a human being's worth. Diane's mother, Patricia, was warm in the vague, diplomatic way of women who have spent 30 years married to a man like Gerald, always finding something gracious to say, always smoothing the room after her husband had ruffled it, never quite standing between him and the people he chose to diminish. Connor, Diane's younger brother by 4 years, worked in the family firm and had absorbed his father's worldview entirely, with the addition of his own particular cruelty. Where Gerald dismissed people with the surgical indifference of a man who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of him, Connor did it for sport. He was 34, handsome in an assembled, effortful way, and he used wit the way lesser men used fists. I knew all of this. I married into it with open eyes and a genuine belief that Diane was different from the family that had produced her. And for the first 4 years of our marriage, I believed I had been right. She was warm with me in private. She defended me gently, carefully, but consistently when her father made his little comments. She laughed at Connor's jokes without joining in when they were at my expense. She told me more than once that she had chosen me precisely because I was not like the men her father approved of. Somewhere along the way, I could not point to the moment, and I have tried, that changed. I believe it began when my career plateaued, not failed, plateaued. There is a distinction, but it is not one that Gerald Hartwell's family were equipped to make. 3 years ago, I made a decision that from the outside looked like professional timidity. I turned down 2 large commercial contracts, the kind that would have given the firm a different kind of visibility, a different number on the revenue line, because I had identified something else. Something I wanted to build more than anything I had ever been commissioned to build, something I had been thinking about for nearly a decade. I pulled back from the firm's public profile. I kept my head down. I said very little to anyone, including Diane, because the project was not ready to be spoken about and because I had learned, by then, the specific way that powerful men in Diane's family treated ideas that had not yet hardened into assets. From the outside, I looked like a man who was drifting. Gerald Hartwell noticed. He always noticed. And so did Diane. The mileage logbook was not the beginning, it was the confirmation. The beginning was a receipt. 6 weeks before the Thursday morning in November, I was clearing the passenger seat of Diane's car. She had asked me to move it out of the garage to make room for some boxes her mother was dropping off, and I found a petrol station receipt wedged under the seat. Woodfield Services. I knew Woodfield Services. It was a motorway services complex on the A route heading southeast out of the city, 41 miles from our house, 41 miles in the opposite direction from Patricia's. It was time-stamped at 14:47 on a Friday. I stood in the driveway holding it for a moment. Then I folded it neatly, put it in my shirt pocket, moved the car out of the garage, and said nothing. That evening, I went to the kitchen drawer and opened the logbook. I cross-referenced the 11 Fridays since September, the 11 Fridays Diane had driven to her mother's house for what she described as their weekly lunch and afternoon together. I noted the odometer reading I had recorded on the first Friday, a habit so ingrained it was almost unconscious, and the reading from the previous evening. Then I sat with the mathematics. Patricia's house, 6.1 miles. Round trip, 12.2 miles. 11 trips with generous allowance for variation, 150 miles. Actual mileage recorded, 847. Unexplained miles, 697. I closed the logbook. I returned it to the kitchen drawer. I went upstairs, where Diane was watching something on her laptop in bed, and I kissed her on the forehead and told her I was going to take a bath. She smiled without looking up. In the bathroom, I sat on the edge of the tub with the door locked and did not feel the sharp volcanic grief I might have expected. I felt something colder and more precise. I felt the particular clarity of a man who has been handed a structural survey and found, in the technical language beneath the formal report, a single word he was not expecting. Condemned. I needed to know more before I decided what to do. I am an architect. I do not tear down a building on the basis of one survey. I gather my evidence. I examine the foundations. I make certain before I act. The following Monday, I drove to an electronics supplier I had used once before for a site security project, and I purchased a compact dashcam, the kind with audio recording, dual channel, front and rear. I fitted it myself. It took 11 minutes. Diane never noticed it. By the second Friday, I had what I needed. I want to be precise about what I heard because precision matters here. At 12:34 p.m., the audio captured Diane making a phone call. The hands-free connected automatically. The line rang 3 times. A man's voice answered. The kind of voice that belongs to a man who is accustomed to being answered. "I'm 20 minutes out," Diane said. "Good," said the voice. "I've had the kitchen done since you were last here. You'll love it." "I can't wait. Is anyone?" "No, just us, the whole afternoon." She laughed. Not the laugh I had fallen in love with at the auction, the one that filled a room without trying to. This was different, softer, deliberately contained, the laugh of a person performing intimacy for a private audience. "Marcus has no idea," she said, and her voice was almost affectionate when she said it, the indulgent tone of a woman describing a trusting child. "He's so wrapped up in his little drawings. He wouldn't notice if I drove to the moon every Friday. His little drawings." I listened to the recording twice. Then I saved it to a secure folder on my phone, locked it behind a 6-digit code, and went to a meeting about load specifications for a residential project in the south quarter of the city. The meeting lasted 2 hours. I was precise, attentive, and completely present. I had learned to be very good at holding 2 things at once. "I need to tell you about the preceding year, not because I want your sympathy. I have never been interested in sympathy, but because without it, what came later will look like cruelty." And it was not cruelty. It was measurement. It was a man who had been handed a ledger of debts not of his own making, deciding very carefully how they ought to be settled. The humiliation did not arrive all at once. It never does in a family like the Hartwells. It arrived in increments, in passing remarks, in half-heard conversations, in the particular social architecture of family gatherings designed to make certain people feel the exact dimensions of the room they occupied and the distance between that room and the rooms that mattered. The first entry in my private ledger was the dinner in February. Gerald had taken a table at the Lorne, the kind of restaurant where the chairs are upholstered in the same leather as the menus and the sommelier has opinions. It was his 65th birthday. 12 people, including Diane's aunt and her husband from Edinburgh, who were pleasant and curious and wanted to know what I was working on. Before I could answer, Gerald intercepted. "Marcus is going through what I call a creative pause," he said, swirling his burgundy with the slow, deliberate pleasure of a man who had paid for everything on the table and knew it. "It happens to architects of a certain temperament. They get itchy, they want to chase something meaningful. Admirable, really, in the way that a gap year is admirable." He said gap year the way other men say hobby. Diane's aunt looked at me with an expression that was half sympathy and half the careful blankness of someone who had learned not to take sides at Gerald Hartwell's table. Diane studied her wine glass. Connor said nothing, which was unusual enough that I glanced at him. He was smiling not at the joke, because there had not technically been a joke. He was smiling at the space the comment had created. "The social negative space, the room where a lesser man would feel small," I said. "I'll be sure to bring back some great photographs." Gerald laughed. He thought I was self-deprecating. I was not. The second entry was from the garden party at the Hartwell house in May. Gerald held a party every year in the 3rd week of May. It was ostensibly a celebration of the end of the financial year, the Hartwell groups specifically, which operated on an April close, but it was in practice a display. The garden was a statement of intent, perfectly maintained, geometrically ordered, the kind of garden that announced itself as expensive in the same quiet, insistent way Gerald announced himself as wealthy. 43 people. The usual mixture of business associates, old friends of the family, and a rotating cast of younger people whom Gerald was either cultivating or evaluating. I arrived with Diane at 6:15. She had dressed with particular care, a cream linen dress, the pearl earrings her father had given her for her 30th. She looked beautiful in the way she always looked beautiful at these events, slightly apart from herself, slightly performing. I noticed that she greeted 3 people before she greeted me. That is, she broke away from my side within 4 minutes of arriving and did not return to it for the next hour and 40 minutes. I spent part of that hour and 40 minutes talking to Philip Renner, who managed a property fund out of the city center and who had actually read the Urban Design Journal and wanted to talk about sustainable residential density, which I was happy to do. I spent the rest of it standing at the edge of Gerald's garden holding a glass of Chablis and listening. What I heard from across the precisely maintained lawn was this. Gerald was standing with two of his business partners, men in their late 60s, property developers of the old school, the kind who still referred to buildings by their cost per square foot before anything else. He was telling them about Diane, about her intelligence, her instincts, her father's blood running true in her. He was generous and warm and thoroughly convincing in his pride, in the specific way that a man can be generous about something that is an extension of himself. Then someone asked about me. There was a half-second pause. It was very brief. Gerald was too skilled a social operator to let it lengthen into anything obvious. Marcus is a talented man, Gerald said, talented and principled. He cares about what he builds. That is a virtue, of course. Some virtues are more commercially viable than others. The two men laughed. I moved to the other side of the garden. I touched the small object in my jacket pocket, a slim, matte black USB drive, the kind with no branding, no identifying marks. I had been carrying it for 6 weeks by then. I pressed my thumb against its cool surface for 3 seconds, the way a man touches a compass needle to reassure himself of true north, then let it go. The third entry in my ledger was from the Sunday lunch in July. This was a smaller gathering, Diane and me, Gerald and Patricia, Connor and his girlfriend Sienna, who was a corporate lawyer and who I had always found sharp and privately decent, a quality she concealed at family lunches with admirable discipline. It was a warm July and we sat in the conservatory. Patricia had made a whole roasted chicken with 2 kinds of salad and a lemon tart that she had clearly spent the morning on. The lunch was pleasant for the first 40 minutes. Gerald talked about a development he was completing in the Eastern Quarter, a mixed-use complex, 300 units, retail on the ground floor. He talked about it the way he always talked about his projects, with the specificity of a man to whom numbers were the primary language of achievement. Then Connor, who had been quiet for longer than was natural for him, leaned back in his chair and said, with the casual perfection of a man who had been saving the line, "Dad, you should give Marcus a role on the Eastern Quarter project, something entry-level, get him back in the game. Isn't that what they say? Sometimes you have to go back to basics." There was a beat of silence. Sienna looked at the tablecloth. Patricia reached for the salad bowl. "I appreciate the thought," I said. "No, seriously," Connor continued, the picture of helpfulness. "I mean it charitably. Every architect needs a commercial anchor. Otherwise it's just," he made a vague, benevolent gesture, "expensive paper." I looked at him across the table. He met my eyes without blinking. He was enjoying himself completely. "Connor," Diane said. "What?" "I'm being supportive." Gerald said nothing, which was, I had learned, his signature approval. Later that afternoon, helping Patricia carry dishes from the conservatory to the kitchen, she put her hand briefly on my arm and said, very quietly, "He doesn't mean it as badly as it sounds, Marcus." I smiled at her. She was wrong, but she was trying, and I had always had time for Patricia. The 4th entry in my ledger was from the evening in September. This was the one that cost me the most, not the most pride, the most trust. Diane and I had been at Gerald's for a dinner, just the 4 of us, a midweek occasion that Patricia had suggested and that had felt, for most of the evening, unusually peaceful. Gerald was tired, which made him expansive rather than combative. Patricia was in a good mood. Diane was warm, genuinely warm, the way she was in the early years, talking easily, touching my arm when she laughed. Driving home, I thought, perhaps I have been reading the architecture of this marriage incorrectly. Perhaps the cracks are cosmetic. Perhaps. We went to bed. At 2:17 in the morning, I woke to the sound of Diane's voice from the bathroom, low and careful and shaped by the specific care people take when they believe they are not being heard. I did not move. I am very good at stillness. "I know," she was saying. "I know, but you have to understand it's complicated." A pause. "He's a good man, Julian, that's the whole problem. He's a good, quiet, careful man who has been going nowhere for 3 years and doesn't seem to notice or care, and another pause. Longer. "I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'll see you Friday." She came back to bed in the dark. I was on my side, facing away from her, breathing evenly. She slept within 12 minutes, I know because I counted them. A good, quiet, careful man who has been going nowhere for 3 years. I lay there in the dark and thought about that. I turned it over the way you turn over a piece of material to examine its reverse, looking for the defect, the fault line, the place where it would give. Going nowhere, that phrase lodged in me like a splinter, not because she was entirely wrong about the appearance of things. She was, in the limited view available to her, describing something real. She could see the surface, the smaller public projects, the quieter professional profile, the apparent drift. What she could not see, what she had not asked about, what she had accepted at face value because accepting the surface is easier than studying the structure, was what was happening underneath. She had not asked, that was the thing I kept returning to, lying in the dark beside my sleeping wife. She had not asked. The fifth entry in my ledger required no witnessing. It was delivered directly. 3 weeks after the September dinner, Gerald called me, not Diane, me, on my direct line at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning, which meant he had looked up the number and waited until office hours. It was a gesture in Gerald's language of professional seriousness. Marcus, I'll be direct with you because I think you're a man who can take directness. I told him I appreciated that. I've been watching you for 7 years. I watched you build something decent with your firm. I respected the standards. And I've watched you spend the last 3 years making what I can only describe as a series of deliberately small choices, comfortable ones. He paused. I waited. I have an opening, a senior logistics coordinator. It's project-facing, well-compensated, would give you the kind of commercial exposure that your current trajectory isn't. Gerald, I said. Let me finish. I appreciate the call, I said. I'm going to decline. A pause that was 3 degrees colder than his usual ones. Marcus, I am trying to help you. I know, I said. Thank you. He hung up 11 seconds later. Connor heard about the call. Diane must have told him and sent me a text message that same evening. A single line, no punctuation, delivered with the breezy confidence of a man who expects to be found funny. Dad offers you a lifeline and you say no thanks. I'm genuinely starting to think you might be the bravest man I know or the most deluded. Hard to tell from here. I screenshot the message, added it to the folder. The sixth and final entry in my ledger did not come from the Hartwell family. It came from Diane herself, and it was the one that required the most of me to write down without feeling the particular bitterness that I had been careful, throughout all of this, to keep out of the record. It was an evening in October, 3 weeks after the September dinner. Diane was on the phone in the kitchen, not hidden, not quiet, simply present in the way of someone who has stopped accounting for your attention because they have decided over time that your attention is not a thing that needs to be managed. She was speaking to a woman I knew slightly, a friend from her university years named Harriet, whom I had met 4 or 5 times at various social events and who had always struck me as sharp and genuinely fond of Diane, which I had never held against her. I was in the hallway, coat still on, having come in from a site visit. The door to the kitchen was 3/4 open. I was not eavesdropping, I was simply arriving home. I don't know, Harriet, Diane was saying. I think about the future and I try to picture it and it keeps being the same picture. Do you know what I mean? Marcus is lovely. He is genuinely lovely, but lovely isn't a plan, is it? A pause. Harriet said something I couldn't hear. I know I sound awful, I know, but you know how I grew up, you know what my father built. And Marcus he's content to design beautiful small things and feel good about himself, and I need more than beautiful small things. I need to know we're going somewhere. I stood in the hallway, I did not move. I know he loves me, she said. The tone was the gentlest thing I had heard from her in months, and it was the thing that cost the most. That's not the question. It never was. I set my bag down quietly on the hall floor. I sat on the bottom step of the stairs. I stayed there for a long time. She loved me. That was the terrible, clarifying fact at the center of all of it. She loved me, and she had decided, in the private accounting of her own heart, that love was not the same thing as a future. And she had found someone who represented, in her calculation, the kind of future her family had taught her to want. A man named Julian, a kitchen being renovated in a house 41 miles southeast of ours. I thought about all of it, the ledger, the receipt, the audio, the mileage, and I understood for the first time with complete clarity what I was actually doing. I was not gathering evidence for a confrontation. I was gathering evidence for a reckoning, not with Diane, not even with the Hartwells, with the version of myself that had spent 3 years being invisible and calling it restraint. I had made myself small in the life she could see. I had kept the meridian private, protected, guarded, legitimately so, necessarily so, but the effect was the same. I had given the people around me only the surface to read. And they had read it exactly as surfaces are always read, by what they showed. I was not angry at Diane for reading the surface. I was done with presenting it. The folder now contained 1 petrol receipt, 1 dashcam audio file, 6 ledger entries precisely dated, precisely recorded. I am an architect, I document everything, and I was ready. Let me tell you about the Meridian Project. 3 years ago, I identified a 17-acre site on the northern edge of the city, a former industrial complex, decommissioned, partly cleared, sitting in a zone that had been earmarked for residential development in the city's 20-year infrastructure plan, but that no developer had yet moved on, because the soil remediation costs and the planning complexity made it, in the short-term calculations of commercial property, unattractive. Gerald Hartwell had looked at it. I knew because the site agent told me when I first visited that a large property group had commissioned an initial survey 18 months earlier and walked away. I did not walk away. I spent 6 months studying the site, the soil reports, the infrastructure projections, the planning framework. I spent another 4 months building a development proposal, not a commercial one, but a mixed-tenure sustainable residential community. 420 units, 23% affordable housing, integrated green space, a design language rooted in the industrial heritage of the site. The kind of project that wins awards but that serious money has historically avoided because the margins are thinner and the timeline is longer and the exit is more complex. What serious money had not yet calculated, what I had calculated in the patient, structural way of a man who had been thinking about this for a decade, was that the regulatory environment was changing. That the city council's new planning director was a woman named Helena Marsh, who had come from a background in sustainable urban development, and who had written, in her previous role, a policy paper that I had read 3 times and annotated in pencil. That the infrastructure investment fund that had been quietly accumulating capital for 2 years was looking for exactly 1 flagship project in exactly this city for its initial deployment. In the 14th month of the Meridian Project, I incorporated a holding company. In the 19th month, I secured a conditional agreement with the infrastructure fund. In the 26th month, I brought in Samuel Vance, the only person in the world I trusted completely, and structured his involvement at 40%. My stake, 60%. In the 31st month, 2 weeks before the Thursday morning when I stood in the kitchen holding the mileage logbook, the City Planning Authority granted full consent. The Meridian Project had an assessed development value of £47,300,000. On the evening of the day consent was granted, I sat alone in the project office, a converted unit on the 2nd floor of the site's remaining original building, exposed brick, a desk, 2 chairs, a drafting table covered in drawings, and I opened my laptop and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then I took the USB drive from my pocket, inserted it into the laptop, and verified that every document was there. The planning consent, the infrastructure fund agreement, the development company's structure, the project timeline, the architectural drawings for all 420 units, 15 months of work, every line made by my hand. I closed the laptop. I held the USB drive for a moment. Its smooth matte surface was cool against my thumb. I thought about Diane saying, "He's so wrapped up in his little drawings." I thought about Gerald saying, "A series of deliberately small choices." I thought about Connor saying, "Expensive paper." Then I put the drive back in my pocket, locked the project office, and drove home. I called Samuel Vance on a Friday morning, not the Friday Diane was out. I had stopped monitoring those Fridays. I had what I needed. I called him at 7:45 while she was still asleep, and I was standing in the project office with a takeout coffee and the full planning consent file open on the desk in front of me. Samuel was 51, a structural engineer by training who had moved into architecture in his mid-30s and found his calling in buildings that were required to do more than simply stand. He was methodical, unhurried, and possessed of a dry, precisely calibrated wit that he deployed sparingly. He had been married to the same woman for 23 years. He was the only person, other than the infrastructure fund directors and Helena Marsh's planning office, who knew the full scope of what the Meridian Project was. He had known me for 15 years. He knew, because I had told him 3 months earlier in terms I had chosen carefully, that my marriage was in difficulty. He had listened without interrupting and then said, "What are you going to do?" And I had said, "The right thing in the right order." And he had nodded, which was Samuel's version of unqualified support. "I need you to come to the Hartwell Foundation Gala," I said. There was a pause. "Gerald Hartwell's charity gala?" "Yes. The one where he raises money by making people feel socially inferior until they open their wallets. That's the one. And I should come because I need a witness, I said. And I need you to bring the Meridian folder, the full one, hard copy and digital, and I need you there at 7:15 precisely. Another pause. I could hear him thinking, not hesitating, just building the picture. Is this it then? He said. Yes, I said, this is it. He was quiet for 3 seconds, then, well, I'll need to find my good jacket. He arrived at 7:15, he always did. The Hartwell Foundation annual charity gala was held every December at the Meridian Grand Hotel. I will not pretend the name was lost on me, in the hotel's first-floor ballroom, which overlooked the city through a run of tall Georgian windows, and which Gerald had been hiring for 11 consecutive years. The charity was a children's literacy organization that Diane had been involved with since before we were married and which gave the event its moral cover. The attendance list was a precise cross-section of the city's commercial and civic establishment. 220 guests, a 5-course dinner, an auction, speeches. I had attended every year of our marriage as Diane's husband. I had sat year after year at the table allocated to the Hartwell family, always near the front, always visible. And I had made conversation with Gerald's business partners and drunk his wine and watched him work the room with the smooth, practiced energy of a man who had built his life around being observed and admired. This year he had announced at the September dinner that he intended to make a formal announcement about the Hartwell Group's next major development, a large commercial site in the eastern quarter of the city, the one he had been describing over the summer. His architect, he said, was a firm from Bristol. They would be presenting the concept visuals. It would be, he said, a statement of the company's direction for the next decade. He had told me this directly across the table in the tone of a man who knows his audience and knows exactly what he is doing. I had listened carefully. Then I had gone home and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Helena Marsh's office to confirm that the Meridian consent and associated documentation were in the public planning record and available for download. They were. The second was to Adrian Chow, a journalist at the city's principal business publication who had been trying to get me to speak about the Meridian project for 6 weeks and whom I had, until that evening, declined. I told him that I was ready to discuss the project. I told him that the announcement would be made publicly at a private function on the 15th of December. I gave him enough detail to confirm the story was real. I asked him to hold it until the following morning. He agreed without hesitation. The third call was to the office of Hartwell Group's largest single business partner, a man named Richard Forsyth, who ran a commercial development fund and whose relationship with Gerald was, as far as the city's business community was concerned, the most important professional alliance Gerald possessed. I did not call Forsyth himself. I asked his assistant to ensure he received, before the gala, a sealed envelope from Webb and Vance Architectural. The envelope contained a single printed sheet. A summary of the Meridian project, its planning consent, its development value, and a note that read, "You may find this of interest. I will be happy to discuss it on the evening of the 15th. M. Webb. Forsyth called me back within 4 hours. We spoke for 37 minutes. By the time I dressed for the gala on the evening of the 15th, every piece was in position. The venue, the audience, the timing. The documents in Samuel's hands, the business publication holding the story. The folder of evidence, the receipt, the audio, the ledger, saved in duplicate on my phone and on the USB drive in my jacket pocket. I adjusted my tie in the bedroom mirror. Diane was finishing her hair at the dressing table. She was wearing the champagne-colored gown she had bought in October. She looked beautiful. I stood behind her for a moment, looking at our reflections. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," I said. We drove in silence that was not uncomfortable. She thought it was not uncomfortable because we were both simply tired from the week. She was right about the tiredness. She was wrong about its source. We arrived at the Meridian Grand at 7:05. The ballroom was already 3/4 full. The noise of it, that particular social noise, 200 conversations layered on each other, the clink of glasses, the note of a string quartet at the far end, met us at the door. Diane moved immediately into it, her posture changing as she crossed the threshold, becoming the Hartwell daughter, the familiar confidence of a woman in her natural environment. I moved more slowly. Gerald was near the entrance, holding court with 4 men I recognized, 2 of them board members of the Hartwell Group, one of them an alderman, and the 4th, standing slightly apart and watching the room, was Richard Forsyth. Forsyth was a compact, precise man of 62 with close-cropped gray hair and the contained watchfulness of someone who had spent 4 decades making decisions that other people's livelihoods depended on. He saw me. He gave a small, considered nod. I returned it. Gerald noticed the exchange. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, a very slight recalibration, the social equivalent of a structural calculation revised. Marcus, he extended his hand, firm, brief, proprietary. Diane looks magnificent, as always. She does, I agreed. I hope you're planning to enjoy the evening. The auction catalog is particularly strong this year. There's a piece I think you'd appreciate, a beat, calibrated to the millimeter, given your aesthetic preferences. He meant, given that you can't afford the others. I'll take a look, I said. I moved into the room. Connor found me 20 minutes later near the bar, while Diane was across the room with her mother and 2 of Patricia's friends. He was in a suit that announced itself as expensive and carrying a glass of champagne with the ease of a man who has never had to think about what things cost. Marcus, you actually came. I come every year, Connor, right, of course, the loyal husband. A smile that was 3 millimeters too wide. Dad's announcement tonight should be impressive. The Bristol firm, have you heard of them? Hadley Partners. Very commercial, very efficient. None of that, another vague gesture, idealistic baggage. He touched his glass to mine. Not a criticism of you, just an observation about market forces. I looked at him over the rim of my glass. Enjoy the evening, Connor, I said. He laughed, pleasant and untroubled, and moved away. At 7:15, Samuel Vance walked through the ballroom doors. He was carrying a slim leather portfolio under one arm. He was wearing his good jacket, dark navy, well cut, understated. He scanned the room with the patient efficiency of an engineer reading a site plan, found me, and walked over without hurrying. Everything in order, I said. Everything in order, he confirmed. He tapped the portfolio once. Hard copy index, tabbed, USB with the full digital set, planning consent certificate on top, and Forsyth has read the summary. Wants 15 minutes with you before the dinner sits down. I checked my watch. 7:18. Dinner was called at 8. Good, I said. Samuel looked around the room with his particular expression of dry, forensic calm. Gerald Hartwell is a man who has spent 65 years measuring everything, he said. I suspect this will be an educational evening for him. I expect so, I said. We walked toward where Forsyth was standing. Between 7:18 and 8 o'clock, I had the conversation with Forsyth that I had been building toward for 6 months. We stood near the tall Georgian windows that overlooked the city, our backs to the room, the lights of the skyline arranged beyond us like the diagram of something enormous and only partially legible. Forsyth spoke in the measured, bottom-line language of a man who had spent 40 years reading buildings and the people who built them. He had reviewed the meridian summary I had sent. He had, I discovered, also pulled the planning consent documents from the public record that very morning and had his legal team review the holding company structure before arriving. It's clean, he said, very clean. Better than clean, it's elegant. Thank you. I'll be direct with you, Marcus. Gerald Hartwell is a man I have respected and partnered with for 30 years, but the Hartwell Group has been leveraged beyond what its current pipeline can comfortably service over a 24-month horizon. There are 2 board members who know it and are not happy about the Eastern Quarter commitment. I have been looking, honestly, for a reason to restructure that relationship. I was looking for it before tonight. He turned his glass slightly in his hand, looking out over the city. You've given me one and offered a better opportunity at the same time. I appreciate your directness, I said. The Meridian Retail and Community Specification. Is it allocated? Not yet. Then I want the conversation. You'll have it. First week of January. He nodded, the way decisive men nod, not as punctuation but as a signature. A decision made and filed. We returned to the room. Samuel, from his table across the ballroom, raised an eyebrow fractionally. I gave the smallest possible nod. He understood and looked back at his dinner. The dinner was 5 courses of meticulous food that I barely tasted. I sat at the Hartwell family table, my assigned seat, as always, at the outer edge of the family's social configuration. Gerald was at the head, Diane was to his left. Connor was beside Diane. Patricia was to Gerald's right. Forsyth, as a senior guest, was 2 tables away but positioned with a direct sightline to ours. Samuel sat at a table near the room's center. When I looked for him during the second course, he met my eyes and held them for exactly 1 second. Everything was in position. Gerald's announcement came after the fourth course. He stood, the room settled immediately, the reflex of 200 people who understood that when Gerald Hartwell stood up at his own event, you listened, and spoke for 7 minutes about the Hartwell Group's Eastern Quarter development. He was good at it, precise, visionary, generous in crediting his team. He introduced the lead architect from Hadley Partners, who was seated 2 tables from ours and who stood and acknowledged the room with professional ease. There was applause. Gerald sat down. Connor raised his glass toward his father. Diane touched Gerald's arm. Patricia beamed. I set down my fork. I stood up. The room had not entirely settled from Gerald's speech. There was still the post-announcement noise, a low, conversational warmth, chairs adjusting, service resuming. But the people at our table and the tables immediately around us noticed. Gerald noticed. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been surprised by something he calculates very quickly to be either irrelevant or manageable. He settled on manageable. He was wrong about that. Marcus, he said, quiet, cautionary. I apologize for the informality, I said, and I was not apologizing. I spoke clearly enough to be heard at the 4 closest tables without raising my voice. I'll be brief. I have something to share with the room. I should have said something sooner, but the timing wasn't right until tonight. I reached into my jacket pocket. I placed the USB drive on the table. Its matte black surface caught the candlelight. Samuel, across the room, opened the leather portfolio. Most of you know me as Diane's husband, I said. A few of you know me as an architect. Some of you may know me as a man who has spent 3 years making, as I believe the phrase has gone, deliberately small choices. I looked at Gerald when I said that. His face was very still. I'd like to introduce you to those choices. I nodded to Samuel. He stood, walked to where Forsyth was seated, and placed the open portfolio on the table in front of him. Forsyth leaned forward. The people around him leaned forward too. I picked up the USB drive. 3 years ago, I identified a 17-acre site on the northern edge of the city, a former industrial site that every developer with a short-term calculation had looked at and walked away from. A pause. The room was quieter now, not silent. The string quartet at the far end had stopped, which I had not arranged, but which happened regardless. I spent 31 months developing a proposal for 420 sustainable residential units on that site. Mixed tenure, 23% affordable housing, carbon-neutral design specification. The kind of project that some people in this room have described over the years as idealistic. I said idealistic without inflection. I did not look at Gerald when I said it. I looked at Forsyth. 2 weeks ago, the City Planning Authority granted full consent for the Meridian project. I heard someone say, the Meridian, 2 tables over, a woman's voice, the note of recognition. The assessed development value is £47,300,000. My ownership stake is 60%. I am the lead architect and majority stakeholder. The quality of the silence had changed. It was not the polite silence of people waiting for a speaker to finish. It was the silence of recalculation, of 200 people simultaneously revising the architecture of what they thought they knew. I looked at Gerald. He was looking at me. His expression was not the one I had expected, not anger, which would have been simpler. It was the expression of a man confronting a structural survey that has just told him something fundamental about a building he thought he understood. Gerald, I said, you called me 3 months ago and offered me a senior logistics coordinator role. You said I had been making comfortable choices. I paused. I think the record will show that while I was making those choices, I was finishing the largest sustainable residential development this city has seen in 20 years. While your firm was declining the same site, a beat, I didn't think the timing was right to mention it. I apologize for the delay. There was a sound from across the table. Connor. He had put down his champagne glass and was staring at me with an expression that had lost, for the first time in 7 years of my knowing him, its practiced ease. He looked genuinely young without it. Connor, I said. I drew my phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. On the 14th of October, you sent me a text message. You said, and I want to be precise, I unlocked the phone, found the screenshot. Dad offers you a lifeline and you say no thanks. I'm genuinely starting to think you might be the bravest man I know or the most deluded. I looked at him. I appreciate the options you offered. I've thought about it and I've concluded that the answer wasn't either of those things. I was simply busy. Connor said nothing. I looked at Diane. She was very still. She was watching me with something in her eyes that I had not seen there in a long time, genuine attention. Not the performed attentiveness of a spouse at a social event. Real, startled focus, the face of someone confronting a building they thought they knew from the outside and discovering it was a different structure entirely. "Diane," I said very quietly, "you told someone a few weeks ago that I was wrapped up in my little drawings. I want you to know that the drawings you were referring to are the architectural plans for 420 homes. They are filed with the City Planning Authority. They are, legally speaking, quite significant documents." A pause. "I also want you to tell me," I said, "how the kitchen is coming along at Julian's." The air went out of the table. Patricia's hand stopped halfway to her water glass. Connor's jaw tightened. Gerald looked, and this was the only moment in the entire evening when I felt something close to what I had expected to feel, and it was not triumph. Gerald looked old. Not in the physical way, in the structural way, like a building in which a critical support had just been quietly removed. Diane's face did not collapse, it did something more complex. It became very honest. All the performance came out of it, the social layer, the family event layer, the Hartwell daughter layer, and what remained was simply a face. A woman's face, 36 years old, in a champagne gown, in a room full of people she had known for years, understanding in real time the precise size and weight of what she had done and what had been watching it. She said nothing. I picked up the USB drive from the table. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. I felt a profound and particular sorrow, the kind that is not sharp like grief but wide like a landscape. The sorrow of a man who had built something he had hoped would last and was standing in the rubble of it at last, looking at the precise location of every crack he had chosen, for too long, not to see. I put the drive back in my pocket. I buttoned my jacket. "I'll see myself out," I said. "Thank you for the dinner, Patricia. As always, everything was excellent." I walked out of the ballroom. Samuel fell into step beside me at the door. We walked out into the cold December air. He said nothing for a full minute. Then, "Well done, a very difficult thing, cleanly executed." "Thank you, Samuel," I said. We stood on the pavement outside the Meridian Grand Hotel, and Samuel hailed a cab, and the city went on around us, indifferent and enormous, and I breathed in the cold air for a long time until it became ordinary again. What happened afterward happened in the way that consequences tend to happen, not all at once, and not as dramatically as the moment that caused them, but with the quiet inevitability of a structural failure that was always coming. I want to be precise about something before I describe the consequences. I did not engineer them. I am aware that the story, as I have told it, might suggest a man who sat in a darkened room moving chess pieces across a board with cold satisfaction. That is not what happened. What happened was that I built something real. I protected evidence of things that were real, and I chose a moment to make what was real visible to the people who had been reading the surface and finding it insufficient. The consequences that followed were not punishments I designed. They were the natural load-bearing outcomes of a structure that had been built by other people on assumptions that were false. False assumptions in architecture and in life do not fail on a schedule. They fail when the weight exceeds the capacity. The Hartwell family had been placing weight on false assumptions about me for 3 years. The gala was simply the moment the weight exceeded the capacity. That is not cruelty. It is physics. Adrian Chow's article ran the following morning in the business publication under the headline, "Webb and Vance's Meridian Project. The £47 million development nobody saw coming." It was thorough, accurate, and included a quote from Helena Marsh's planning office describing the Meridian Project as a landmark approval that sets a new standard for sustainable urban development in this city. It was read, shared, and discussed. Within 48 hours, it had been picked up by 2 national architecture publications. Richard Forsyth called Samuel on the Monday. He wanted a meeting. The meeting ran for 3 hours. 6 weeks later, Forsyth's fund committed to a commercial partnership with Webb and Vance for the Meridian's retail and community space specifications, a contract valued at £2,400,000. He also, in the course of that meeting, mentioned that he had been reviewing his relationship with the Hartwell Group for some months. The gala, he said, with a precision that I appreciated, had been clarifying. Gerald Hartwell's announcement about the Eastern Quarter development received the coverage it deserved. It was not nothing. But in the week when the Meridian story was running, it was not the story the city's business community was discussing. At a property investment lunch in January, a colleague of Gerald's told a mutual acquaintance that Gerald had been unusually quiet about the Hartwell Group's pipeline. By February, two of the board members I had seen at the gala had moved their individual consultancy relationships to firms that were not Hartwell adjacent. The empire did not crumble, it contracted. Quietly, proportionally, and entirely logically. Connor lost the account he had been leading for the Eastern Quarter project, not through any action of mine, but because the Bristol firm, Hadley Partners, restructured their subcontractor arrangements after the project's scope was revised. He spent 3 months being publicly certain it didn't matter. He spent the following 3 months being less publicly certain. Sienna, Connor's girlfriend, ended the relationship in March. She did not list reasons publicly. Those who knew her well noted that she had always been quietly decent. Diane and I filed for separation in January. The settlement was handled by lawyers and was, in the end, fair. I ensured it was fair. I had no interest in cruelty and never had. The house was sold. Diane took an apartment near her mother. She took a position with a small arts charity, not her family's foundation, a different one based across the city. An entry-level development role. She went to work every day, and by every account that reached me, she did it without complaint and with genuine effort. Patricia called me in February. I answered. She said, "I want you to know I am sorry, Marcus, not on anyone's behalf, my own." I told her I knew that. I told her I was well. She asked if she could stay in touch, and I said yes, because she had always been decent to me and because some things survived the wreckage of the structures they were housed in. We still speak occasionally. She asks about the project. I tell her. She listens with genuine interest. 7 months after the gala, a letter arrived at the firm. Natalie, who managed our front desk and had been with Webb and Vance for 6 years and who was discreet in the way that only people who genuinely care about the people they work for can be discreet, brought it to me without comment. She set it on my desk, said nothing, and left. The envelope was plain, white, first class, no return address. But I knew Diane's handwriting the way you know the structural signature of a building you have spent years in, the particular forward lean of her lowercase letters, the way she looped her G's, the slight irregularity of her capitals that she had always been mildly self-conscious about and which I had always found specific and real. I'm going to tell you what it said as accurately as I can. It was 2 pages. She wrote that she was not writing to ask for anything. She wrote that she was not writing to explain or justify because she had spent 7 months understanding that explanation and justification were different things, and that she had spent too much of their marriage reaching for the former when the latter was what the situation required. She wrote that she had found the work she was doing at the charity strange at first, the smallness of it, the practical ordinariness of it, and then unexpectedly necessary. She wrote that she had started to understand what it meant to do a thing not because it was observed and rewarded, but simply because it needed doing. She wrote, "I think I married you partly because I believed you were different from my family. And then, when things got difficult, I held you to my family's standard anyway. I don't know how to account for that except to say that I see it now clearly and I am sorry for it." She wrote that she hoped the Meridian was everything it was supposed to be. She wrote that she had read the article and looked at the planning drawings on the council website and that they were beautiful. She wrote, "His little drawings. I have thought about those 3 words more than anything I have ever said in my life." The letter ended there. No request, no question, no bid for response. I read it twice. I set it on the desk. I sat with the specific weight of it, not pain, not vindication, but something quieter and more honest than either. The feeling of a man reading the actual survey of a thing he had known was damaged at last in full. I did not reply. I did not delete it. I placed it in the back of the brown leather logbook, the mileage logbook, which I had kept, for no reason I could have precisely articulated, in the drawer of my desk at the project office. It felt like the right place for it. 2 documents, one that measured distance, one that tried to account for it. The Meridian project broke ground in the spring. I was on site on the first morning, early enough that the light was still low and lateral, throwing long shadows across the cleared ground and catching the dust in the air and turning it, briefly, amber. I had been on enough building sites in my career to know that groundbreaking is a ceremony, not a beginning, that the real beginning is in the room where a man first looks at a piece of land and decides, against all reasonable commercial calculation, that it is worth fighting for. My real beginning on that site had been on a gray Tuesday morning 31 months earlier, standing on a patch of rubble in a light rain, holding a site plan in one hand and a flask of terrible coffee in the other, thinking, yes, this. But standing there on the morning of the groundbreaking, watching the first machinery move across the remediated earth felt like something different. It felt like a proof. In architecture, you prove a design not on paper, but in the moment it meets the ground. The drawings are an argument. The building is the proof. 420 homes, 420 families eventually living in something built on a foundation of genuine intent, a structure designed to last. Samuel was there. He brought 2 takeout coffees and handed me one without ceremony. We stood at the site boundary in the early morning cold and watched the machinery and said nothing for a while. 3 years, he said eventually. 31 months, I said, a man of precision to the end. I smiled at that. There was a moment about 20 minutes in when the sun came fully over the eastern horizon and hit the site at a particular angle, the low, precise angle of a spring morning, and the whole cleared ground lit up in a way that made it look briefly like something that had been waiting to be found rather than something that was about to be made. I stood there and held that. I let myself hold it for as long as it lasted. Then the light shifted, as it always does, and the site became a construction site again, and I finished my coffee and went to work. Here is what I know, standing on that site with the low morning light in my eyes and 31 months of patient, careful work beneath my feet. There is a certain kind of man, maybe a certain kind of person, who believes that worth is visible. That it announces itself, that a human being without visible evidence of their value is a human being without value. Gerald Hartwell believed this. Connor learned it from him. Diane, for a while, let it reshape the lens through which she saw me. And there is another kind of man, the kind who builds foundations before he builds anything else, who understands that the most important work is often invisible because it is the work happening beneath the surface. Who knows that a structure is not proven by how it looks from the outside, but by what it can bear. I never stopped building. I never raised my voice. I never needed them to see it until the moment the foundation was finished and ready to carry the weight. The architecture metaphor is not lost on me. I have been told that I think in structures, that I see the world as load-bearing walls and stress tolerances and demolition orders. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps the habits of a profession become, over time, the habits of a mind. But if that is so, then here is the principle I have built my life on, and which I offer to anyone standing in a room with a logbook in their hand, doing mathematics they did not want to do. You cannot build on a false foundation. You can decorate it. You can furnish it. You can host beautiful dinners in it and fill it with the sound of people who love each other. But the foundation is the foundation. And eventually, in the way of all structures that are asked to carry more weight than their base was designed to bear, it will speak. It will speak in small things first. A crack in the plaster. A door that no longer hangs quite true. A window that sticks in the summer when the ground shifts. You can ignore these things. Many people do. They fill the crack and repaint the wall and sand the door back into its frame and call it maintenance. And for a while that works. For a while the surface holds and the house looks fine from the street. But the foundation knows. The foundation always knows. And the longer you ask it to carry what it was not built to carry, the more certain the reckoning becomes. I am not telling you this to be hard. I am telling you this because I spent 7 years loving a woman in a house where I knew, somewhere beneath the level of conscious thought, that the ground we were building on was not entirely true. I kept painting the wall. I kept sanding the door. I told myself it was patience or generosity or the particular long view that the people who love the most are required to hold. Maybe some of it was. But some of it was also fear. Fear of the survey. Fear of what the honest reading of the foundations would show. The logbook did not make me brave, it made me specific. It gave me a number 847, and numbers in my experience are the beginning of honesty. You cannot negotiate with a number the way you can negotiate with a feeling. It is what it is, it measures what it measures, it does not care how you feel about it. 847 miles. 697 unexplained ones. And a marriage built on a foundation that neither of us had been fully honest about, her with her Fridays and me with my silence that had finally, at last, been asked to carry the true weight of what it was. The question is only whether you are the one who chose the foundation, or the one who discovers too late that someone else's hands were in the cement. I chose mine. And when everything built on a lie came down, and it came down quietly, proportionally, with the logic of engineering rather than the drama of cinema, what remained was exactly what I had built. A foundation of integrity, 420 homes, and enough room at last to begin again. What do you think? Did Marcus wait too long, or did he get it exactly right? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you for being here.